Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live in the studio with me today, I have Jason Callahan. Jason is the Vice President of Human Resources at TruckPro in Memphis, Tennessee. Jason is an executive with a proven track record of achievement in many areas, including human resources, finance, operations, merger and acquisitions for global multi-billion-dollar organizations. His company, TruckPro, is one of the largest independent distributors of heavy-duty aftermarket truck parts and accessories in the United States. Jason, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Angela.
Well, I really wanted to bring you in today because I mentioned to you that I've had a number of folks on the program who have been involved in different parts of hiring, but your specialty is human resources. And so you're the first person that we've actually had on the podcast to talk about hiring from a human resources perspective. So I appreciate that. For those folks who are listening who are not familiar with TruckPro, I gave a little bit of an overview, but can you explain in a little more detail just so they have some context, what is TruckPro?
Sure. As you mentioned, TruckPro is one of the largest independent distributors of heavy-duty aftermarket truck parts in the United States and Canada. We also service heavy-duty trucks, and we have a wholesale business as well. There are over 160 locations throughout 40 plus states in the United States, as well as in 3 provinces in Canada. We have almost 2,000 employees and across all of those locations. So it's a growing business. It's a fragmented market, but between the independent owner-operators and a couple aftermarket parts distributors make up a large majority of that market share.
Oh, that's great. And so when you say heavy-duty trucks, we're talking about those big semis that we see on the highway. Is that true?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Over-the-road trucks, but also garbage trucks, buses. So anything heavy-duty tractor trailers, farm equipment, you name it, that would fall in that heavy-duty category.
Oh, that's interesting. So you have worked in human resources for a number of years. My first question is really, how have you seen sort of the hiring process evolve over the past 10 to 15 years? I'm sure you've seen some changes.
Well, it's going to age me now that you say 10 to 15 years. But no, the actually got into human resources in early 2000 during the dot-com boom, and have been in and out of human resources over the last 15 years. So definitely seen a lot of changes. Everything is electronic now. You would actually be surprised, though, some companies actually still have paper applications. Some large companies that maybe in the retail space that aren't as progressive as some, but for the most part, everything is online. It's all electronic. Applications feed into human resource information systems, so it really minimizes the administrative work that HR professionals have to do in data entry and putting people into the system. But with applicant tracking systems these days, we can automatically create requisitions, we can go through the approval process, we can move candidates through the hiring pipeline, and it's all automated, and we're able to keep notes on candidates as it moves from interviewer to interviewer. We're able to put salary history, we're able to track references, and so automating everything just makes it a paperless environment, and it makes things just so much more efficient and effective from a communication perspective. For me, it's very important for us as well, given that we have so many locations. So, our corporate headquarters are here in Memphis, but as I mentioned, we have 160 locations throughout the U.S. and Canada. So when we're interviewing somebody in L.A. and we need to interview them or have notes on that individual back here in Memphis, we can share that through our applicant tracking system, which really helps automate things, or via email. So it's definitely a more of electronic world today.
Okay.
Also, you were able to set up knockout questions. People who are applying online automatically we're looking for certain types of candidates with certain backgrounds, experiences, and competencies.
Okay.
So we can set up questions that automatically would select or deselect an individual based on those answers without them even getting through to the first round of interviews. So it helps us really wade through the number of resumes we may get for any individual or specific opening.
You must get a lot. I keep hearing feedback here, especially here in Memphis, that when positions come open, that some companies are receiving hundreds of applications within like 24 hours. I mean, are you seeing things like that?
I think some of the bigger companies, definitely that are the Fortune 500 companies across the U.S. I came from, my prior employer before TruckPro was a global Fortune 100 company with over 130,000 employees globally. And so, yeah, we had the brand recognition, and when we post a project engineer position, for example, there'd be a flood of hundreds of applicants. With TruckPro, we're a little bit different. We're in a niche market, although we're the second largest aftermarket parts distributor in the industry. We don't maybe have the brand recognition of an AutoZone or a FedEx or an IP or one of the other major employers here in Memphis. But we do get quite a few applicants that come from the heavy-duty market, and it does take time to go through that. And the same, if we were to post on a Career Builder or Indeed or a Monster, those applicants are there's more of them, and they're broader from a background and experience perspective.
So for your company, are you posting TruckPro positions on those sites like Indeed and Career Builder? Or if I was interested in TruckPro, would I have to go directly to your website?
We do both.
Okay.
Quite frankly, I've steered away from posting on Indeed and Career Builder and Monster just because the flood of applicants that we're going to get and the non-qualified applicants that we get through there. So we have to go through every resume. We have to treat them as applicants. And so we really direct people to our website. But more often than not, we're proactively recruiting candidates. So we're looking at passive candidates specifically who aren't necessarily in the job market or looking for an opportunity. Then we're reaching out through networking, through LinkedIn, through industry trade publications, through industry trade shows that we attend, getting to know our competitors, and people that we come in to face-to-face every day out in the field. So more often than not, we're proactively sourcing candidates versus reactive and posting and letting the candidates come to us.
That's
Again,
great.
Without the brand recognition of some of the other players, they're not going to naturally see TruckPro and apply. So we have to go out there and actually get to know those candidates and source them ourselves.
I do think that's a good lesson, though, for listeners, is that you can't only look on places like Indeed and Career Builder, because I think probably there are a lot of companies who have positions that may be posted on their own website, but that may or may not be easily found on other sites. And I think also, it's about, I always encourage clients to make a relationship with a company. And one question I get that you kind of touched on there too is a lot of people ask me, is it worth keeping a LinkedIn? Is LinkedIn worth anything? And you just mentioned something there that sounds like you sometimes seek people out through things like LinkedIn, and you approach them sometimes when they haven't approached you. And I think that's important for job seekers to keep in mind.
Oh, technology is such a vital part of recruiting for us in all the companies I've worked for, whether that's through LinkedIn, whether that's through Facebook, whether that's through Twitter, whether that's through our website. And it's critical that people in transition or career seekers or whatever, where you are in your phase and looking for that next opportunity, that you have a professionally maintained LinkedIn site, that your Facebook is professional. Believe it or not, we look at candidates all the time based on their Facebook. And if it's not professional, or if there's comments or pictures that may not be appropriate, then, a lot of times we're looking the other way at for other individuals.
Right.
So I think that's important to know as well. Also, given the types of candidates we're hiring, whether that's senior level executives or that's college graduates. I think social media is more critical with younger generation people coming out of school. We have starting to build a robust university relations program at Truck Pro. We're really targeting some local colleges and universities to build relationships with, and using social media is going to be critical in attracting that talent.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So a lot of my clients who come to me in our very first meeting, they express that they've been applying online. I've had people come to me and say they've applied to hundreds of jobs online, and it's like a big black box to them. They can't seem to crack that box or understand sort of what happens. From your perspective, you described a little bit of it, but can you talk a little bit about, on your side of the fence, what's happening? I mean, somebody has applied online, and then what happens?
So depending on the software that's running their online applications and their website, a lot of times those resumes and the applications will never get to the hiring manager or to HR, quite frankly.
Oh,
like
wow.
I said, they're being knocked out based on specific criteria, whether that's education, GPA, years of experience. So a lot of those things that you don't even realize you're putting in when you're filling out the application or uploading your resume never even gets to human resources, or much less the hiring manager.
Right.
So it's a tool that companies can use, and the bigger companies have that type of software that they use. Some of the smaller, medium-sized companies, they don't. So they have a general web portal that they use that you can go and fill out a generic application, and that's going to go to a recruiter or HR manager or someone in the front office that's most likely going to look at it. But at the same time, if it's just a cold call per se, or a cold resume with no introduction, nobody's supporting it, no champion, no referral, then it just ends up a lot of times as just another resume that gets filed in the trash box. So I really encourage people that if they find a job online that they interest them, to actually go and find somebody that they know within that organization and really network with that individual and better understand what they're looking for in that position, understand who the hiring manager is, understand who the decision makers are, understand who's involved in the interview process, and where they are in the interview process. So unfortunately, a lot of times, candidates may get frustrated and they see a job posted online and they never get a call or they never get an interview and they think they're uniquely qualified for this role.
Right.
But an organization may already have someone internally already selected for that job, and their internal procedure says they've got to post the job for X number of weeks or whatever the case may be. So the job may not be even officially open for that individual, and they're running down a road that's going to a dead end. So getting inside of an organization, having somebody that understands the scope of the job, where they are in that process, is just critical to minimizing frustration and getting to the decision makers.
I think that's a really good point because, I work with a lot of job seekers who come in and, it's almost like, their feelings are really hurt because they've been applying and applying and applying. They haven't heard anything back. And I've, made this point, which is sometimes the company is just required to post something. Like if a company were to start out with someone as a contractor and turn them into a full-time employee, sometimes they do have to post that position before they can officially transfer the person over. And if that person's already been working there for a couple of years, I've been in this situation myself before, the company's not going to hire someone else. They're just going through the formality because they have to. And it's not really a reflection on those who apply. It's a reflection on where they are in the process. So I think that's a good point. You really can't make the judgment. You can't take it so personally. It's not always about your resume. It may be that the company isn't truly looking for someone, or maybe they were looking for someone and you're at the end of their process and they've already extended an offer to someone else, but they haven't yet taken the posting down. So I think it's good to sort of keep in mind that there are a lot of factors that you're not aware of that are going on. Well, Another group, so many of the people who come to me here in my practice are people who are looking to make a big career change. Maybe they are coming from finance and they want to go to marketing, or they want to go to a different area. And I mentioned in your introduction that you've worked in a lot of different parts of the business. Can you talk a little bit about the advice that you would give to those people who really want to make a big career change and make a big shift?
Sure. I've had the opportunity to work in different parts of the business, and it's, I don't think I would be where I am today without that diverse background and experience that I've had. And I made the career shift by going back to school. So my undergrad's in human resources, and worked out of school in a professional HR job for a couple years, and it just wasn't a fit. Didn't really feel like I was adding value or making a difference, and so I decided to go back to business school, and I got my MBA in finance, and moved, graduated, and was going to school at the same time with a professional MBA program. At the same time I was working, and there was an opportunity to be a senior financial analyst within my organization. So they gave me that opportunity as a proven commodity internally. Although I have zero finance experience, I was able to go and get a business degree in that and move into finance. And that really started to open the doors to other areas throughout the company. And but without that piece of paper per se, I would have never had that opportunity. If I would have just gone to the business unit controller or the CFO and said, hey, I want to make this career change and I want to go into finance, and I've got, 3 or 4 years of professional HR experience, that it was said, no way, right?
Right.
So I really had to make that commitment, and it was, anybody knows who works full time and then goes back to school, you're putting your social life on hold for a couple years, and it's a big commitment. But definitely think that's something I had to do to make that career change. And once I got into finance and got that exposure in just a different part of the business unit, I was able to go into run a P&L, moved into engineering, and responsible for an engineering team. And then from there, moved over into mergers and acquisitions, and moved into operations on that side of the house as well. So, and I was able to do that just through internal champions. I think having an internal champion is underrated, and people don't talk about it as much as they should. But at every one of those stages along the way, somebody took a chance on me because I didn't have experience. I was an engineering manager over 25 engineers. I had no engineering background whatsoever. These are double E's and MEs that I managed, and I was just a business guy, right? I was the HR and finance guy, and what do I know about engineering? But the leader of that organization saw me as bringing different values and different competencies to the table that they hadn't necessarily had in the past, that really balanced out the strengths and weaknesses of that team and just gave them a different perspective. And I was in that role for a little over 2 years, and I think they really appreciated my perspective, and I definitely appreciated their perspective and their role. And, as soon as that assignment was over, that same individual introduced me to the VP of mergers and acquisitions and strategy, and really supported me and was my champion into my next role, moving into mergers and acquisitions. And so I think proving yourself at every level obviously is critical. Having that champion to support you as you move throughout your career, whether that's within one organization or that's moving from organization to organization, I think you need to have that person there to really support you and back you. And I was also in a culture that fostered that and really valued being a business leader and a people leader. And they said, they identified Jason as a people leader, and it didn't necessarily have to be in HR or in finance or in operations or mergers and acquisitions. That skill is transferable across all of those different disciplines. And so I think that also is underrated. There are many organizations out there, unfortunately, that don't necessarily value general leadership skills and abilities and competencies, and they want technical competencies. They want you to be an engineer. And so there are multiple companies that said, hey, you don't have an ME with an MBA or a double E with an MBA, so you can't lead this team, or you didn't grow up in the business as a technician and an engineer, then a project manager, and then an operations manager, so you can't be a branch manager. So that's another piece too, that although you may have the desire to go out and diversify your skill set or go get different education and different experiences,
right,
it's got to be married with a company that also values that,
right,
and wants to move leaders across the organizations. And I think there are progressive companies out there, and most of the top companies to work for, most of the top companies in this world really value those leadership skills and those competencies, and identify those early on in people's career and really help foster that throughout their career. But at the same time, there's a lot of companies that don't. And I think you need to find that right mix to have that opportunity.
Well, I think you made a couple of great points. One is, it sounds like most of your career transitions it was through relationships. I mean, you also used the education to really back that up, but you went and you found people to help you and to champion your career all the way along. The other point that I liked was that you mentioned you just need one person to take a chance on you. The thing is, once you've made that change, once you've done M&A at one company, it's not going to be that hard to get another company to say, yeah, you've done this before, but you've got to get the very first chance. And it's like you said, you've got to find a company that values you in a way that will be willing to take that chance on you, because not every company will. And I think it's realizing that some companies will and some companies will not, and seeing that difference. Because, I've worked with clients before who've had that experience where they've had a couple of companies tell them, no, you're not the right fit. You don't have experience in this area. And so they just assume, I can never do this job. Like, I can never get into this area. But really, it's about, working on those relationships and looking for a company that will be open and one chance, somebody that will give you a chance. The one last thing I think that you mentioned that's pretty important here is that you made a lot of these changes within the same organization. So it's easier to make a big shift in terms of if you want to go from operations to marketing or, different areas. It's easier to make that shift if you're already within a company or if you're already within an industry. It's harder to make that shift if you want to both shift between functional areas and you want to shift between different industries at the same time. That's much harder to sell. I mean, I think it's easier to either keep the same role in a different industry or, do a different role in the same industry. But to do a different role in a different industry, I think it's more tricky.
Definitely, and I have experience with that as well. Moving to Memphis from Dallas as a trailing spouse, and being in transition for a while here. That my last two roles, executive level roles, were in human resources, and really wanted to move back into mergers and acquisitions and get closer to either doing the deal and integration or in operations and being closer to the end user and the customer. And what I found here locally was that because my last two higher level roles were in HR, that people viewed me more as an HR person.
Yes.
And they weren't willing to say, although you have 2 or 3 years of M&A experience and a couple of years of operations experience, we view you as an HR leader, not an M&A or operations leader. And so what I had to do was I ended up having to go find an HR opportunity with an organization that was willing to also use me in other avenues like M&A and operations. So I was able to find that at Truck Pro. I was able to get in and really help with doing the due diligence, finding the deals, helping with the integration, and that's a large part of my role today at Truck Pro is helping with due diligence, leading the due diligence effort, and helping lead from an integration perspective as well. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, but I had to get my foot in the door at Truck Pro in an HR role, mainly in that capacity, probably 70-75% of my role, with 25% being M&A and integration. And that's the best of both worlds, but it was challenging to make that shift to say, okay, well, my last role was in HR, and now I just want to cut ties with that, and I want to get back into M&A or operation. Although I had that experience, that wasn't necessarily the last experience at the top of my resume. And so I would agree with you that it's a lot easier to make those shifts or those transitions internally within an organization versus from one organization to another, or even harder from one organization to another in a whole nother industry.
Yeah, you make a really good point. I actually faced a similar issue once. I started working in corporate when I was 19, and I spent most of my career in corporate. But 1 year I worked for a nonprofit. And when I went and started interviewing for corporate jobs, after having worked in a nonprofit for 1 year, the corporate employees would say, "But you work in nonprofit. How could you possibly want to work here?" And I went, "What do you mean? I've been working in corporate since I was 19. I only went to a nonprofit for 1 year. What are you talking about?" But it was really hard to get their eyes off that very top line. Like, this was the most recent thing that I had done. It really surprised me because it probably discounted, 6 or 7 years of prior corporate experience just due to this one year of nonprofit. So it can be really frustrating for sure. Well, one thing that you mentioned too is that you moved to Memphis from Dallas. And, I find some folks who are interested to move to other cities, and sometimes they move before they found a job. And it can be really hard. I mean, you mentioned you had a lot of great champions at your previous company. And then you came to Memphis, and I'm assuming that you maybe didn't have as many contacts in Memphis. What advice do you give to people who are sort of in that situation where they've shown up in a new city, they don't have a job, and they don't have a lot of contacts?
Get involved. So we moved to Memphis not knowing a soul. We knew nobody, and made a conscious effort knowing that I was making a career change and will be moving companies because the company I worked for didn't have a presence in Memphis, and actually ended up commuting for a while. So that was that helped with the transition. But knowing long term that I wanted to find a Memphis-based company and somewhere that I can invest in here locally, and I made a point to get involved. So within 3 months of moving to Memphis, I reached out to Nancy Coffey at the New Memphis Institute here in Memphis, a leadership organization, and got into a leadership class there and started networking. And didn't have any local champions. I had obviously lots of references and referrals from my old company, had personal references that helped me get into that organization. But that was just step one in helping network. And then, like I mentioned before, my wife actually moved here for her job. So I was able to leverage her boss and her peers within her organization and people that they knew in Memphis.
Oh, that's great.
Memphis is an incredible city. It's very opening to folks, and they're making a conscious effort to attract and retain young talent. And I found that here locally. Although it's not a Dallas or an Atlanta or Chicago, and it's not a huge job market, there is opportunity here, and there's opportunity for sharp, bright people who want to make a difference. And I found that. So I was just able to network. I didn't, quite frankly, I was in transition for 9 months. I applied for one job online and had over 120 face-to-face meetings, and from CEOs of the Fortune 100 companies that are headquartered here, to small business owners and everyone in between. And everybody was more than happy and to help me through my transition. And I just feel that in Memphis, it's a little bit different than some of those bigger cities, although there may be more opportunity, no doubt. The opportunity to network here is critical. But, moving to, from a small city or medium-sized city to a large city, it would be the same process. Go in and get involved, network, get involved in the chamber, get involved in, nonprofits, get involved in just networking events and different civic groups or business groups, and they're all over the country, regardless of the size of city you're in, from 20,000 people, small town, rural city, there's a business organization. There is the chamber, and up to the New Yorks and LAs of the world, for sure. So that would be by far my number one advice to anybody looking to transition and make that next move in their career. And it's networking, and it's the basics of networking and really getting out and putting yourself out there and wanting to make a difference.
I think that those are great points, and you mentioned about Memphis is such a big, small town. I think one advantage that job seekers have here is it's easier to be kind of a big fish in a little pond here. And so sometimes when I work with job seekers who want to move to another city, I suggest that they consider cities similar to Memphis, that may be kind of underdog cities, that may be up-and-coming cities that people are not totally in tune with yet. And they may have less total opportunities, but those cities may be trying really hard to attract new talent because maybe they don't have people there who do what you do. And, whether it's, there are a number of these cities, but, those cities that are, say, like around 1 million people in the total metro area that are going through a lot of redevelopment, Oklahoma City, I would say, is one. There are a number of cities that would fall on this list, but I really recommend that people at least consider those cities because sometimes, especially when we're in a city like Memphis and we want to relocate, we think of a city like New York City or Los Angeles as our target, which are not bad cities, but there are a couple of misconceptions. One of them, to me, is that the job market is much more competitive in those cities, and that's a fact. And I believe that when you have more competition and when you have more talent, sometimes that talent ends up being paid slightly less, even though the cost of living in those cities is higher than in Memphis or in a city like Memphis. And so sometimes people will say to me, but aren't they going to give me a cost of living increase at my, in my salary? And I say, well, maybe if you were transferring with the same company, they might. But if you're going to a totally new company, they're going to pay you what you're worth compared to the people who live there. And if there are 100 qualified people that can do that job, they're not going to overpay you and pay to move you there if there's someone who lives there that can make a little less. So in my mind, if you want to go to a really large, highly competitive city, especially if you're young, it can be great. But I just think people need to be aware your lifestyle may have to change. I mean, when I lived in Los Angeles, I downgraded from a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment that I had by myself to the tiniest 1-bedroom apartment I've ever had that had, no air conditioning, no dishwasher, no parking space, and it was considered very nice. Like, it was in a neighborhood where a lot of celebrities lived, and but it's just a totally different standard. And so I think when you mention some of those advantages to Memphis, it's important for folks to think about the bigger picture before they move and really get an idea. And I think, too, if someone's thinking of moving, it's a good idea to go visit the city and see what they think of it. Because sometimes people have an idea in their head, and when you show up and you actually immerse yourself, it's completely different.
And I would agree with that. And, I've told people this, the individuals I met with and had meetings with during my transition, and even ongoing from a networking perspective here locally, I wouldn't even have had a chance to talk to their executive admins in Dallas.
Right.
And that's the honest truth. I mean, the accessibility to the senior leaders here, the politicians, the business leaders, the nonprofit leaders, it's nothing. And I only have, Dallas to compare it to, but I've traveled all over the world and worked in different cities throughout the world. And just the accessibility to that level, and those are decision makers, and those are people who are creating jobs for people, not, who are making higher decisions, they are creating positions. And so I would agree with you wholeheartedly that it's a city like a Memphis or Louisville or an Oklahoma City or an Omaha or something like that, they're rebranding themselves and they're really putting a foot out there to attract talent. The accessibility of those people making the decisions is just a lot easier.
Yeah, and what I hear you describing when you talk about your job process, and I think I mentioned this to you earlier, is it sounds like you're actually kind of you went around the traditional process a little bit. You didn't you said you applied online like one time, and everything else was, you had over 100 in-person meetings. That's really a strategy that I work with my clients, is a lot of times to go around that traditional process, because it is the black hole sometimes that we talked
Right.
about, and you don't always get your name in front of the right people. And it sounds like for you that was a pretty effective route.
Sure, and I think that's definitely and I'm speaking from an HR perspective and leading an HR team with TruckPro and with other companies. My advice is always to get to the decision maker, and that's the hiring manager. That's the individual who is ultimately going to make the decision on who's going to fill this role. And sometimes that's working through HR, but many times that's working through other contacts in the organization, individuals, peers, their friends, maybe people that individual sits on a board with a nonprofit not even related to that organization. So I think being creative in how you network and get to that decision maker is critical. And many times, from a networking perspective, jobs aren't even posted and people are making higher decisions. And that's really what I found unique with my opportunity at TruckPro, is that, I landed that opportunity. It was never posted. They never searched. I was there, talking about M&A and opportunity and how I can help them consult and acquire and integrate companies. And they said, well, here, we needed an HR leader as well. And the timing just worked out that I was there. And so that job was never posted. They never hired an executive search firm. And it was the right place at the right time. And so I think that more often than not happens is that, you're just having to network and you never know where that next meeting is going to lead.
Right.
Or that interface with somebody, at the park or at a community event or at church is going to help lead you to your next opportunity. And so I would always advise to take advantage of all of those opportunities and never take them for granted, because especially in small, medium-sized markets like in Memphis, it could definitely lead to your next opportunity.
I totally agree. I sometimes work with folks who say to me, gosh, I don't really have time to go have these networking meetings, or, that company doesn't have a job posted. Why would I go talk to them? Or, and you can't only, in my view, focus on every time they have a job posted. I mean, like you said, sometimes they've already got that job filled. Or if you're not someone who they already know, maybe they're not going to be terribly interested in you. Versus if you target organizations and you make relationships with them, then they will think of you when they do create positions in the future. But I guess for those folks who are following kind of a traditional process and they're applying online, from your perspective, from an HR perspective, what could someone do to make sure that their resume sort of stands out, or what could they do on the online application to try to ensure that they are someone that actually is considered?
I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I say the best way for your resume to stand out is have someone personally deliver it as a referral within that organization to the hiring manager. If you get someone within that organization that can say, hey, I know this guy, and they can walk over to the hiring manager or human resources and say, hey, you need to talk to this person.
Right.
That's ultimately the best way for your resume to get to the top of the stack. And I think with technology as it is today, with everybody having some type of social profile or business profile online, and as well as we are all connected globally, there's no reason not to be able to find somebody within an organization that at least you can connect with and build a relationship with, who could then act as a referral for you internally. But say you don't have that opportunity, I think the biggest mistake people make is, and this is so such common sense, but I see people with high-level educations with lots of experience have grammar and spelling mistakes in your resume. The quickest way for your resume to be thrown out, in my opinion, is for you to have grammatical or spelling errors on your resume. It's a no-brainer, and it happens every single day. I see it every single day. For your resume not to be formatted, for not to be aligned, for there to be different font types, different font sizes. Just the basics you would think are so simple, people take for granted day in and day out. And with the market becoming more and more competitive these days, that's something that you just really have to focus on. I think tailoring your resume for the organization is critical as well. So if you're going to an organization that's got an incredible brand, an incredible marketing organization, you need to stand out. You need to have a wow resume per se. If you're going to a very traditional organization that's a suit and tie and bureaucratic, maybe in the banking or finance industry, you need to have a very tailored resume that's very professional looking and standard, right? And so I think tailoring your resume, tailoring your introductory letter, your introductory paragraph, your objective for the organization is critical. Nothing worse than getting a generic resume with a generic objective, with a generic cover letter.
Right.
That means you haven't done any of your homework. You haven't even tried to understand the company or the position or the opportunity. And so to me, those are things that, just doing your homework a little bit, putting a little bit of extra effort into tailoring your resume to the culture or the industry or the business. And then obviously your cover letter and your introductory, objective or even email that you send to people that is tailored specifically to that opportunity.
Yeah, key. I totally agree. That's all very, very helpful. And earlier you mentioned that you actually sometimes look at candidates' Facebook pages, for example. Can you talk a little bit more about social media and, are there certain things that you recommend people avoid? I mean, I usually recommend that they just set their social media so that people that are not their friends really can't see very much. So they can just take that kind of off the table. But I mean, what is kind of your thought?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, that's very going to be the conservative and safe way from a Facebook perspective. Most of the time we're recruiting using LinkedIn.
Okay.
And referrals and references more than anything else. Facebook may be a secondary site that we can go just bounce a name off of and look at and make sure. But if it's private and it's blocked to people who aren't their friends, then that's obviously the safe and conservative way to go. TruckPro really values references, and that's something I've learned just recently over the last few years of my career. Is I always took references for granted. People aren't going to put references on resumes or give references that aren't going to give good feedback, positive feedback, and that's true. But more often than not, a hiring manager can really get down to the nitty-gritty based on the questions they're asking references.
Sure.
And so I would make sure that when you list your references, you're reaching out to those references, that you're letting them know that you've applied for a specific position, that they're going to be calling you, that if they have any questions about your background, that they understand your background and experiences. It may have been years since you worked with this person. They may not have known what you've done since then, and you never know. So we check references, thoroughly check references. And when I say we, the hiring manager, because typically they can get a lot more out of a reference than human resources can.
Sure.
And we coach our hiring managers on asking really tough questions to references. And we ask for references that actually know candidates, not give me HR to validate employment.
Sure,
we can go validate employment all day, or your education or your GPA or anything like that. But, really understanding a candidate is critical. And I think because the cost of a new hire and getting it right is so expensive, that we're doing our more homework on the front end than when we were 10, 15 years ago, when a lot of times we're just taking people at face value. And we can't afford to do that anymore from a risk perspective or a cost perspective. So we do our education on the front end, and I think it's critical for candidates to realize that too, that, hey, I'm not just listing 3 to 5 references to check a box. There are many organizations, and Truck Pro being one of them, that we're going to call those references and we're really going to probe. And I would really encourage candidates to coach or have those conversations and make sure they touch out to those people before they list them as a reference.
Yeah, you definitely don't want them to be surprised.
Right.
And I think in addition to kind of catching them up on what you've been doing, it's really nice too to explain, hey, this is what the job is that I'm applying to. This is why I think I would be a good fit for this job, and kind of helping them to understand. Because especially if you're making like a major career shift, you want to be able to say, these are the things that I've done that apply in this particular situation. And you want them to be able to kind of speak to those things that you've worked on together that do apply and that could translate over. But you definitely don't want to take those references for granted. You don't want them to get this random phone call where they weren't expecting it, they don't know anything about it. I mean, it's not going to be helpful to you.
That's a good point.
And it's, certainly they're not going to want to continue to be your reference if you're not respectful of, their time, essentially. So speaking of sort of problems that could come up, what are some of the things that potential job seekers could do that would really be mistakes? I mean, what are some of the big turnoffs that you see job seekers making?
There's a few that come to mind based on my experience in hiring. And one being that going into an interview, the job seeker is too confident. And, I think there is a fine line. We talk about this a lot between confidence and cockiness.
Okay.
And having an ego and an edge.
Sure.
And I think what I've seen recently, and it may be generational, but but I'm not going to go there, is folks are all different. But I think you need to have confidence in your skills and abilities and experience and how they relate to how you can excel in this position that you're interviewing for.
Sure.
But you can definitely err too much of that and have too much of an ego and not be viewed as a team player and not be humble. And so you need to have that mix and interview process of confidence and humility.
Okay.
And not come across as too arrogant or too cocky, because the last thing employers want is to hire somebody that's a know-it-all and that can do everything and is not a team player. And in today's environment, with the collaboration that's required, and we're all working in type of a matrix system,
right?
The teamwork is, I think, more critical than ever, and being able to work with different personality types, different people with different experiences and backgrounds is critical. And if you come across as you know it all, then that's going to be difficult to make that transition. Another thing is not preparing. Going in, just like you need to prepare your resume and your cover letter for a specific position, you need to prepare for an interview. And I know you work with a lot of your clients on that. But I've seen so many folks who come in and they're not prepared. They don't have questions to ask. They're not prepared for specific generic interview questions, behavioral interview questions. And those are things that are very simple to do. You can research online, and even from a questions perspective, you may have 4 or 5 interviews in a given day, and I'll coach people, ask the same 3 or 4 questions to every person. Don't get to your 3rd or 4th interview and say, I don't have any questions for you because my first 2 interviewees answered all my questions. Go ahead and ask them again, because you don't know what their answer is going to be. It could be totally different than your first interview, the question or the answers they provided to your 3rd or 4th interview. So be prepared. That's another huge downfall that I see applicants making. And then another thing is thinking they're a shoo-in. And then I think this kind of goes to the confidence piece, is that they may be consultant and they may be moving into a full-time position and like, hey, there's no one else that can do this job. I'm in. I don't have to work hard. I don't have to put my best foot forward in the interview or application process or the testing process. Or that just looking at a job description online and saying, oh my gosh, this is tailored just for my background and experience, and going in saying, this is just for me. I think thinking you're a shoo-in, not preparing, being arrogant, not being humble, those are three big issues that I've seen just once you get into the door through the interview process.
Wow, that's great feedback. That's really great feedback. So after the interview process is complete, a lot of job seekers, have the question about what should I do to follow up? They've come in, they've actually had an interview in person. What is your recommendation on what they should be doing to follow up, and how often should they follow up?
So I'm gonna go old school here, and again, it's all about differentiating yourself from other applicants. There's nothing better than a handwritten thank you card. It's so easy to send a thank you email. It's so easy to send a mass email to the 5 people you just interviewed with, but to actually go out and write 5 thank you cards tailored to each individual person and send that, it just differentiates you from the other job seekers. Other people aren't doing that. It's not commonplace like it was 15, 20 years ago.
That surprises me so much because it's so easy.
Right. It's something easy, just a little bit of investment in time, but it really helps you stand out from other applicants. So I would encourage always people to do that. Follow up, again, I would ask, going into the interview process, so what is your time frame? What are the next steps? And get an understanding from the hiring manager or human resources, what is their time frame? And I would, based on that time frame and the answers they give you, I would follow up directly with a phone call. I would ask, can I follow up with a phone call? Is it better if I just shoot you an email? How would you like me to follow up? And I would be patient. Be patient. Things don't happen quickly anymore. And the higher up in an organization you're going, the bigger your salary is, the longer it takes.
Right.
Because the decision is it's much bigger. And so don't be offended if you're not getting a call the very next week, or if it's taking a little bit longer than you anticipated, or even than they told you. Hang in there. Be patient. Find unique ways to follow up. I do think finding articles that are relevant to that organization and saying, hey, did you see this? Just keeping your name fresh on their mind is critical, because you may be the first person out of 5 that they interview, and it may take 3 or 4 weeks to interview 5 candidates, and then they have to make a decision. And so, you may be 2 or 3 months into the process, and that just may be standard based on the culture for that organization. So understanding their process, understanding their time frame, and then balancing where you're adding value as far as following up versus where you're being a pest, I think is key. And having someone like you to bounce those ideas off of, or a mentor or somebody else that's maybe familiar with the organization or the culture is critical in that case.
Yeah, I think people really struggle because either they don't want to be a pest at all, so they don't send anything, or maybe they send too much. But I think there's a good spot kind of in the middle, and you may not always hear back when you send those notes, but you should know that they've probably been received and they're probably appreciated. It's just that hiring manager may not have an update for you at that time, and so they may not be able to get back to you, but you still want to stay on their radar.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. The very last kind of thing I wanted to ask you about is, I speak with a lot of people who they go through this sort of new hiring process that we've come to at this point in time, and they'll go through a lot of interviews, and then they will never hear anything back. And it really hurts their feelings. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that and how people should sort of mentally try to handle it?
Right. So like I mentioned before, you may apply for a job and it may not even get to HR, to the hiring manager. So don't be frustrated there. Again, go find a contact within the organization that can really help you navigate the hiring process within that organization. But if you go through an interview process and you don't hear back, and you're following up and you send a thank you card and you still don't hear back from folks, don't be frustrated. I think that's unfortunately the nature of some organizations, that they may have so many applicants for a specific position, or they may not necessarily be as people focused or as talent focused as another organization may be. So they just may not follow up, and it's nothing personal. I think it's unfortunately a lot of times where that organization is and how they value talent.
Right.
And in many cases, I would consider that a good thing. If they're not willing to follow up with you, if they don't respect the time that you've invested in interviewing, then you probably don't want to go work there, because they don't value their employees and they don't value talent. So don't take it personal. I think that unfortunately happens more often than we'd like to think. But if you are able to follow up and they've said they've moved on with another candidate, I would always recommend that you ask, what could you have done better, or what did this other candidate have that you didn't necessarily have, or go ask for some advice. You went through a process, you invested a lot of time, get something out of it, learn from the process. And more often than not, the HR, the hiring manager, hopefully will be honest with you and say, here, this is where things you need to work on, or this is why we went with another applicant. This is where you can go get more of X, Y, and Z experience, or this is how you can go hone your interview skills, or this is where you need to go invest in X, Y, and Z. So get something out of it. You've invested the time into the process, and so you should take something out of it so you can help as you go forward in your career search.
No, I totally agree. It's really helpful. Well, is there any other advice that you'd like to share with our listeners today? I feel like you've shared so much. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate the time, and the questions are great.
Great. Well, thank you, Jason, for joining us. This discussion has been very helpful. Thank you to everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.